Yo, what's up guys, it's Renon here, and we're going to talk about MVPing in the endgame of Lost Ark. And despite the clickbait title, this video will help you as there's a ton of theory crafting going into maximizing your DPS. Just for you guys that might question how the hell I know anything about anything in terms of PvE, I played WoW for a few years doing mythic raiding throughout my time with that godforsaken game. Here are some of my parses in Legion where I was severely outgeared by my raid group and managed to be the number 2 on the DPS meter as well as receiving a 100 parse. For those of you that don't know Warcraft logs, a 100 parse is basically being in the top 0.1 or lower % for my item level and class on a particular fight. And you might ask, how does this matter in Lost Ark? Well, the same principles apply as damage numbers in video games come down to math, and WoW simulation meta and theory crafting allowed many interesting ideas for maximizing damage come to light, and using these same principles I basically do 40 to 50% of the damage in my tier 3 Guardian raids on both of my tier 3 characters, as well as doing the same thing on my Gunslinger ult in tier 2. And I'm not trying to jerk myself off, but I am trying to give people a reason to listen to what I'm talking about. And before we really get into the details of this video, I do want to say and give a quick disclaimer to maximize your stats before heading into a raid. You need to focus on itemizing your engravings, your runes, tripods, gems, and more before really having a chance of doing a lot of damage. If you need a guide for that, check out my class guides on the 3 classes I have covered so far, which are Striker, Berserker, and Gunslinger. And you can also look up the different classes on Loawa, if you pronounce it like that, which is basically a really scuffed Warcraft log for the Korean Lost Ark server, but it is extremely useful for seeing how top people up the ladder on different classes itemize their characters. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's talk about these damage principles, starting off with number 1, which you guys probably know. Number 1, always try to line up your cooldowns together, as in any buff abilities you have lined up with your hardest hitting abilities. You probably understand this one as rotations for each class revolve around this concept. For Striker, it's using Lightning Whisper comboed with your esoteric skills. For Berserker, it's Chainsword and Red Dust with Hellblade, Strike Wave, and more, and you basically get the idea. Many guides are built on this one concept, but let's expand on this concept with rule number 2, which is to not always hyper focus on lining up your cooldowns. Let's get a thought experiment going. Say you're playing Striker and you use your big buff ability called Lightning Whisper, and for those that don't know, it gives an attack speed buff plus an 18% crit rate buff. But as you do the animation, the boss knocks you away and you don't finish the cast to debuff the boss. Now you have 2 options. You can save your esoteric skills for your Lightning Whisper, which can be on a 20-second cooldown, or simply use those abilities without the buff. The correct answer, unless the boss is running away or something similar that will make you hold your abilities, is to use your abilities without the buff. Remember, burst isn't everything. Boss fights are a marathon and not a sprint, in most cases at least, so instead of wasting one rotation for optimized damage, you simply use a weakened rotation and then line up your abilities again after the fact. Think of it like this, you could do around 15 to 25% more damage with the rotation if you saved your cooldowns, or you could use the abilities twice if you don't wait for your cooldowns to line up. And over the course of a fight, not wasting your cooldowns versus saving cooldowns to line them up will likely lead you to use your hard hitters 5+ more times throughout a fight. And this will increase your damage overall by a lot more than lining up said cooldowns. Now let's talk about rule number 3, which is to understand when to line up your abilities. And I know I just talked about the one reason you might want to not line up your cooldowns, but this isn't always the best case scenario. Let's do another scenario. Say you did what I said in rule number 2 and did not wait to line up your cooldowns, but now you'll notice that your Lightning Whisper and your hard-hitting Striker abilities don't quite line up. The main reason you don't line up your skills is because the amount of time you wait is so long that you can likely fit in another damage rotation in all that wait time. Well, generally speaking, if your cooldown will line up if you wait 3 to 5 seconds, then you should probably wait to line up your cooldowns. Not only will this realign your rotation again for optimized damage, but it also allows you to use an optimized damage rotation for only using a few seconds, which is perfectly fine. This is more evident for Berserker over Striker, as your buff cooldowns and hard hitters have a large difference in cooldowns, where in one rotation you might be able to use Hellblade with Red Dust, but its long cooldown means that in the next rotation you shouldn't wait for the cooldown unless you're naturally having to wait to use your damage abilities based off of the boss being untargetable or simply running away. Up to rule number 4 now, be willing to save your cooldowns if there's AoE coming up. This was more apparent in WoW as a lot of bosses had ad spawns on set rotations, so even saving your cooldowns for 20 seconds was worth it, as doing single target damage to only the boss versus blowing your load on 10 ads and the boss was simply 10 times the damage and thus lucrative to do. But unless bosses have a lot of ads in the Legion raids, this doesn't necessarily apply to Lost Ark as much. However, it still rears its head in Armored Nacrocina, where he spawns 5 little scorpion buddies, and you can hold an AoE ability to blow these ads up. On to rule number 5, which is unique to Lost Ark, which is knowing when to back attack. In a lot of ways, you can think of back attacks as another damage cooldown you add to yourself, as back attacks simply act as a buff that gives 5% more damage and 10% more crit rate. This buff can be even better if paired with Master of Ambush, which at tier 3 will increase your damage by another 25%. If you're a class that doesn't use Master of Ambush, then treat back attacks as a minor buff, which means you can look back to rule number 1, 2, and 3 to figure out if you want to save your cooldowns to get behind the boss or use your cooldowns regardless. Lots of times, unless you're a class like Reaper or Deathblade that can quickly get behind the boss, getting to the butt of the boss can take 5 seconds if you have no movement abilities. Generally speaking, take the rule I said before, where if getting behind the boss takes more than 3 to 5 seconds, just use your cooldowns regardless of being behind the boss, because over the course of the fight, you'll get more damage rotations off. But this gets more complicated with Master of Ambush, where you do 30% more damage behind the boss and 10% more crit, which in terms of Lost Ark is an absurd damage buff. The design of back attack classes in Lost Ark is to have them have a lot of maneuverability to get behind the boss, but some are better at it than others. With this in mind, if you have movement cooldowns, then use your movement to get behind the boss and use your damage. It's definitely worth it to try to wait for a boss pattern or to run behind the boss, even if it takes a few more seconds than you'd like, as back attacks comboed with Master of Ambush make a massive DPS increase. Also, depending on your class design, back attacks may be crucial for MVP. Take for example Deathblow Strikers, where almost all of their damage comes from around 2 abilities during their burst window. In this case, they'd want to waste a bit of time optimizing their damage by back attacking than say a Berserker, whose damage comes from a plethora of attacks. Now let's talk about rule number 6, which is using your abilities that have movement tied to them to make the most out of a bad situation. This is most apparent for melee classes than ranged, but say for example you use your cooldowns while behind the boss, and then suddenly the boss turns to attack you. In these type of situations, use your abilities that have movement like Tiger Lightning Strike for Striker or Hellblade, Tempest Slash, and more depending on the class to keep your damage uptime, while also angling your ability off to the side of the boss. The reason for this is twofold. One, you can dodge the abilities of the boss by using your skills to get out of its face, while also clipping the boss's hitbox to continue your damage uptime, thus allowing you to maneuver yourself closer to its back. I also want to mention that you shouldn't be afraid to lose DPS by using an ability to dodge a boss's mechanic, even if you can't clip the boss for more damage. I know right now the content isn't too hard, but when we get into the harder raids with Grudge and Cursed Doll activated, you're really going to want to have the muscle memory to use your damage abilities for movement if needed. Rule number 7 is all about using your movement abilities for uptime. Similar to what I mentioned in number 6, your abilities allow you to maneuver around the boss and help you dodge. A common tactic to maximize your uptime is to wait until the last moment to jump out of a telegraph. That way you waste no DPS running out manually and wasting valuable uptime. This also applies for quickly getting to the boss, where you can use a charge or damage ability with a lot of movement tied to it to quickly reach the boss. This can be the difference between MVPing and not, as good players will utilize their movement to its highest potential. Rule number 8 is to use all your damage if you know the fight's ending soon, regardless of if your cooldowns are lined up properly. This will be more apparent when health bars are enabled in Legion raids, but not so much in Guardian raids, but I still thought this was worth mentioning for the future. Lots of times when the boss is going to die, your huge buff abilities won't be up in time, so simply using whatever your hardest hitting abilities are at the time, right before the boss dies, will give you a nice little chunk of extra damage. Rule number 9 is quite simple: utilize your battle potions to their highest extent. A well-timed Panacea potion, a swiftness potion, or the invulnerability potion could allow you to skip mechanics or quickly rotate to the boss a bit faster than if you didn't use the potions. These battle potions might be helpful in your uptime, so in certain pieces of content, you might want to critically think about what potions you want to use for uptime on a particular fight. And that's it, my guide to MVPing and PvE content in Lost Ark. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I do plan on making more and more Lost Ark content in the future. But anyways, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. And that is going to be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching.